The desperate call, the Zanari Coalition's capital station groaned under another barrage of plasma fire. Commander Therix watched helplessly as the outer ring of habitats vented atmosphere into the cold void. Tiny figures spinning away like seeds from a dying flower. His forearms trembled as he gripped the command console, his species' natural camouflage flickering between shades of despair. 300 cycles of peace had made them soft. The Zanari, the Kellans, the Threxi, and 9 other species had built their coalition on principles of harmony and mutual prosperity. They had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival. Now the Score Dominion reminded them with brutal efficiency. The Score were everything the Coalition was not. Where the Coalition valued life, the Score saw only resources. Where the Coalition built gardens and libraries, the Score constructed war machines and breeding pits. They had emerged from the dark regions of space like a plague, consuming system after system, converting peaceful worlds into factory planets for their endless war machine. Therix turned to his second-in-command, a delicate Kellan whose crystalline form refracted the emergency lights into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Sub-Commander Lyris had served with him for 40 cycles, and never had he seen her usually steady glow pulse with such fear. The defensive grid around Zanari Prime had fallen in less than 6 hours. Their most advanced shields, their proudest achievement in defensive technology, had crumbled like paper before the Score's kinetic bombardment. The tactical display showed the grim reality. Red dots swarmed around their position, each one a Score destroyer or battlecruiser. Blue dots representing Coalition vessels winked out one by one. In the past 72 hours, they had lost 60% of their fleet. The remainder huddled around the capital station like frightened children around a dying fire. Minister Gareth of the Threxi entered the command center, his serpentine body coiling with agitation. His species served as the Coalition's diplomats, their ability to sense emotions making them natural mediators. But now all Gareth could sense was terror and desperation flooding from every being in the room. The High Council had convened an emergency session 3 hours ago. Therix had proposed the unthinkable, the option that had been buried in their most classified files for over 200 cycles. Contact the quarantine zone. Call the Deathworlders. Summon the humans. The Council had recoiled at the suggestion. Better to die with dignity than unleash those monsters upon the galaxy. The humans were quarantined for a reason. Every species that had secretly observed Earth had returned with the same horrifying reports. A world of endless war, where the dominant species had split the atom not for energy but for weapons, where they poisoned their own atmosphere and still thrived, where they hunted each other for sport and called it entertainment. But as another Coalition ship exploded on the tactical display, its crew of 3,000 becoming nothing more than frozen debris, Therix made his decision. The Council could execute him later if they survived. He input his command codes overriding 17 security protocols and accessed the forbidden frequency. The message was simple, broadcast in the mathematical language that their scientists believed humans would understand. Coordinates, images of the Score attacks, a repeating signal that their linguists had determined meant help in several Earth languages. For 20 minutes, nothing. Then a response in perfect Coalition standard language, which should have been impossible. The humans should not know their language. They should not have faster-than-light communication. They should not exist outside their quarantine zone. Yet the message was clear. Zanari Coalition, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force. We have received your distress signal. Help is coming. Hold your position. ETA 37 hours, 37 hours. It was impossible. Earth was over 300 light-years away. Even their fastest ships would take weeks to make that journey. But Therix had no choice but to hope. He had rolled the dice on their survival, gambling everything on the monsters from the quarantine zone. Sub-Commander Lyris pulled up the old observation files on Earth, the ones that had convinced the Coalition to quarantine the entire system. Images of human wars filled the screens. Primitive projectile weapons evolved into guided missiles, chemical weapons that killed invisibly, nuclear fires that turned sand to glass, and through it all, the humans not only survived but thrived. They took their wars to the air, to the sea, even to space. They were a species that had literally evolved through conflict. Minister Gareth studied the files with a mixture of fascination and horror. The humans had no natural weapons, no claws, no venom, no armor, yet they had become the apex predator of a world filled with creatures that should have eaten them alive. They did it through tools, through cooperation, and through a ruthless willingness to do whatever it took to survive. The score, for all their brutality, followed patterns. They were predictable in their savagery. But humans, the file suggested, were chaos incarnate. They would sacrifice themselves to save strangers. They would fight when logic demanded surrender. They would find hope in absolute darkness. They were, in every sense, incomprehensible to civilized species. 20 hours passed. The score tightened their noose around the capital station. They broadcasted their terms: unconditional surrender, conversion of all coalition worlds to score breeding farms, the execution of all government officials, and the enslavement of any species deemed useful. The rest would be processed for biomatter. Therix did not bother responding. There was no point negotiating with genocide. Then, at hour 36, the impossible happened. Gravitational sensors screamed warnings as space itself seemed to tear apart. Massive objects dropped out of hyperspace far closer to the battle than should have been possible. The energy discharge from their arrival was like nothing the Coalition had ever seen. 43 ships materialized in perfect formation. But these were not the sleek, efficient vessels the Coalition built. These were monsters of metal and ceramic, bristling with weapons that looked crude but radiated power that made Therix's sensors spark with overload warnings. The largest ship was easily 4 times the size of a score battlecruiser, a massive wedge of armor and guns that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never heard of elegance or efficiency. A communication channel opened, and for the first time the Coalition heard a human voice. Admiral Chen spoke with calm authority that seemed impossible, given that she had just arrived in the middle of a war zone. Her words were translated perfectly, though Therix suspected the humans were using translation technology far beyond what the Coalition had imagined. The Admiral's message was broadcast on all frequencies, ensuring both the Coalition and the score heard it clearly. She identified her fleet, stated their intention to render aid, and then added something that made Therix's camouflage shift to a color his. Species only displayed in the presence of apex predators. She said the humans were looking forward to the fight. The score response was immediate and predictable. They turned a third of their fleet toward the human ships, launching volleys of plasma fire and antimatter torpedoes. It was enough firepower to crack a small moon. The human ships did not even raise shields. Instead, they accelerated directly into the attack, their point defense systems swatting aside torpedoes with casual efficiency. The plasma fire splashed against their hulls and dispersed, barely scorching the paint. It was then that Therix realized the truth. The human ships were not protected by energy shields. They were simply built so tough that standard weapons could not hurt them. The humans returned fire, and the Coalition learned what Deathworlder weapons looked like. No elegant energy beams or sophisticated plasma projectors. The humans used kinetic weapons, chunks of metal accelerated to speeds that turned them into pure destruction. The first score ship had simply ceased to exist, transformed into an expanding cloud of superheated gas. The second tried to evade but learned that human targeting systems had evolved through millions of calculations, predicting movement patterns with terrifying accuracy. But it was the third ship that truly showed what humans were capable of. Instead of destroying it, the humans disabled its engines and weapons with surgical precision. Then they did something the Coalition had never seen in ship-to-ship combat. They rammed it. The human destroyer simply accelerated to full speed and slammed into the score vessel like a massive battering ram. Both ships survived, locked together in a violent embrace. Then boarding pods launched from the human ship, punching through the score hull like parasites burrowing into flesh. Commander Therix watched his tactical display in stunned silence as the humans began doing the impossible. They were taking the fight inside the score ships. In 300 cycles of civilized warfare, no Coalition species had ever attempted boarding actions. It was considered barbaric, uncivilized, and unnecessarily dangerous. The humans apparently had different ideas about civilization. When Predators Protect Major Marcus Rodriguez checked his rifle one final time, as the boarding pod screamed through space toward the score vessel. Around him, 30 members of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Unit prepared for humanity's first real combat against an alien species. The pod's interior was cramped, hot, and shaking violently as point defense fire tried to stop them. It felt like home. Rodriguez had fought in Afghanistan, Syria, and the Martian Rebellion. But those were against humans. This was something else entirely. The brief they had received on the score was simple: hostile, aggressive, and operating on a hive mind structure. They were essentially facing an entire species that thought and fought as one organism. The pod slammed into the score hull with enough force to liquefy an unprotected human. The Marines barely noticed, their powered armor absorbing the impact. Shaped charges blew a hole through the alien hull, and Rodriguez led his team into humanity's first interspecies ground combat. The interior of the score ship was nothing like human vessels. Instead of corridors and rooms, it was a series of interconnected chambers that seemed to pulse with organic movement. The walls were covered in something that looked like a cross between metal and chitin. The atmosphere was thick with spores that would have killed an unprotected human in seconds. They encountered their first score 30 seconds in. The aliens were exactly what military intelligence had warned them about. 7 feet tall, covered in natural armor that looked like it could stop bullets, with forearms that ended in claws capable of tearing through steel. The score warrior let out a sound like grinding metal and charged. Rodriguez put 3 rounds center mass. The armor-piercing bullets punched through the score's natural armor like it was cardboard. The alien dropped, green blood pooling on the organic floor, but more were coming. Dozens of them, pouring from openings in the walls that Rodriguez had not even noticed. The Marines formed a defensive perimeter, their training taking over. Overlapping fields of fire, grenades for groups falling back by sections to avoid being overwhelmed. It was textbook urban warfare, just in an alien ship instead of a Middle Eastern city. What surprised Rodriguez was how the score fought. They were brutal and aggressive, but they were also predictable. They came in waves, direct frontal assaults with no attempt at flanking or tactical thinking. It was like fighting an angry mob rather than a military force. The Marines cut them down with mechanical efficiency. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the Coalition capital station, Commander Therix watched the battle with a mixture of awe and horror. The humans were not just winning. They were dominating. Their ships carved through score formations like predators among prey. Their boarding teams were taking ship after ship from the inside, and they were doing it all with a casual efficiency that suggested this was routine for them. Admiral Chen contacted the Coalition command directly, her image appearing on their main screen. She was not what Therix had expected. No scars, no obvious weapons, just a middle-aged human woman who looked like she should be teaching at a university rather than commanding a war fleet. But her eyes held something that made Therix's camouflage shift involuntarily. This was a predator who had learned to hide her nature. The Admiral's proposal was simple. The Coalition forces should fall back behind the human lines. Let the humans handle the score. In return, humanity wanted nothing except perhaps a conversation about the end of their quarantine when this was over. Minister Gareth could not hide his confusion. The humans were asking for nothing. No resources, no territory, no tribute. Admiral Chen's response was even more confusing. She said humans had a saying, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." They had heard the Coalition's call for help. Responding was simply the right thing to do. The score, realizing they were losing, tried to adapt. They pulled their forces back, concentrating their firepower. They sent waves of smaller attack craft, hoping to overwhelm the human point defense. They even attempted to ram the human ships, turning their own vessels into massive kinetic weapons. Nothing worked. The humans had an answer for everything. Their point defense systems were designed to handle missile swarms that numbered in the thousands. Their ships were built to take impacts that would shatter asteroids. And when the score tried to board human vessels, they learned why humans had locks on their doors and weapons in their homes. The boarding attempt on the UES Indomitable lasted exactly 3 minutes. The score warriors entered through a breach they had blown in the cargo bay. They were met by automated turrets, Marines in powered armor, and the ship's crew who treated repelling boarders like a fire drill they had practiced 1,000 times. Not a single score made it past the cargo bay. But the real turning point came when Major Rodriguez and his team reached the score ship's command center. The hive mind structure meant that taking out command nodes caused entire sections of the score fleet to falter. Rodriguez did not understand the technology, but he understood weak points. A few pounds of C4 in the right places, and suddenly dozens of score ships were drifting without coordination. The score queen, the central intelligence coordinating their entire species, realized she had made a critical error. She had assumed the humans would fight like the Coalition, with rules and restraint. Instead, she faced a species that had no concept of a fair fight. Humans used every advantage, exploited every weakness, and showed no hesitation in doing whatever it took to win. 6 hours after the humans arrived, the Score fleet was in full retreat. Half their ships were destroyed or captured. Their ground forces on coalition worlds were surrendering en masse, cut off from the hive mind's guidance. The Queen herself barely escaped, her massive command ship jumping to hyperspace with a dozen human torpedoes chasing it through the portal. Commander Theric stood in his command center, watching the debris field that had been a Score invasion fleet. The humans were already organizing search and rescue operations, pulling coalition survivors from destroyed ships. They were sharing medical technology to treat the wounded. They were even repairing damaged coalition vessels with a matter-of-fact efficiency that suggested this was just another day's work. Subcommander Lyris approached him, her crystalline form now pulsing with something that might have been hope. She reported that human medical teams had saved over 10,000 coalition lives in the past hour alone. Their technology was crude by coalition standards, but incredibly effective. They used nanomachines like the coalition used bandages. Minister Gareth was in deep conversation with Admiral Chen, trying to understand human psychology. The Admiral explained that humans had spent their entire evolution fighting for survival. First against nature, then against predators, then against each other. But somewhere along the way they had learned something important. They were stronger together than alone. Their wars had taught them the value of peace. Their struggles had taught them the importance of helping others. The Admiral also revealed something that shocked everyone. The humans had been monitoring coalition communications for decades. They knew about the quarantine. They knew they were feared. But they also knew that someday someone would need their help. So they had prepared. They had built their fleet not for conquest, but for exactly this moment, when the monsters under the bed would become the heroes in the darkness. The Coalition's High Council convened an emergency session. The question was simple, but the implications were staggering. What to do about the humans? They had saved the Coalition, asked for nothing in return, and shown both tremendous power and unexpected restraint. They were everything the Coalition had feared and nothing like what they had expected. The debate raged for hours. Some wanted to maintain the quarantine, arguing that humans were too dangerous to integrate into coalition society. Others pointed out that they had just proven themselves to be the greatest allies anyone could ask for. Finally, Theric spoke up. He had called the humans. He had seen them fight, and more importantly, he had seen them choose not to fight when the battle was won. The vote was closer than anyone had expected, but the decision was made. The quarantine would be lifted. Humanity would be offered membership in the coalition, not because they were safe, but because the galaxy was not safe and it needed protectors who understood that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be very good at war. Admiral Chen received the invitation with the same calm she had shown throughout the battle. She accepted on behalf of Earth, but with conditions. Humanity would join as protectors, not conquerors. They would share their military knowledge, but also their medical technology, their art, their music, and their strange ability to find hope in the darkest places. They wanted to be partners, not overlords. As the human fleet prepared to return to Earth with a coalition diplomatic envoy, Major Rodriguez stood in the observation deck of the Indomitable. Below, the coalition capital station was being rebuilt with human construction equipment. Already, human and alien engineers were working side by side, sharing ideas and solving problems together. Rodriguez thought about the report he would file. How do you explain to people back on Earth that their first alien contact was not a peaceful exploration, but a rescue mission? How do you tell them that humanity's role in the galaxy was not as explorers or conquerors, but as the protectors of those who could not protect themselves? A young Kelani engineer approached him, her crystalline form shifting through colors Rodriguez was learning to interpret as curiosity. She asked him through a translation device why humans had really come to help. They gained nothing from it. They risked everything for strangers who had actively tried to keep them isolated. Rodriguez thought for a moment, then gave the only answer that made sense to him. He told her about something humans called empathy, the ability to see suffering and feel compelled to stop it. The knowledge that every life lost was a story ended, a family broken, a future destroyed. Humans had learned through their own bloody History that everyone, regardless of species, deserved a chance to live free from fear. The Kalani's form shifted to a color Rodriguez had never seen before. Later, he would learn it was the color of wonder. As the human fleet departed, Coalition's space was forever changed. The score were broken, scattered to distant systems where they would take generations to recover. The Coalition itself was stronger, tempered by fire and protected by new allies who brought both terrible weapons and boundless compassion. And somewhere in the void between stars, a message was being broadcast to every inhabited system in the galaxy. The humans were no longer quarantined. The Deathworlders had become life-bringers. The monsters from Earth had proven that sometimes the most dangerous predator in the room was also the one most likely to stand between you and harm. Commander. Therix stood on his command deck, watching the human ships disappear into hyperspace. His camouflage had settled into a pattern his species reserved for moments of profound revelation. He had called for demons and received guardian angels. He had expected conquerors and found protectors. He had feared humanity's arrival, but now he feared their departure more. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. Humans were dangerous not because they were predators, but because they chose who to prey upon. They had evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day, and their response was not to become monsters, but to become strong enough to protect others from monsters. As the last human ship vanished into the void, a new chapter in galactic history began. The age of fear was ending. The age of protection had begun. And at its heart stood a species from a small blue world, a species that had looked into the darkness and decided to become the light. The Deathworlders had come home to a galaxy that never wanted them, and in doing so had saved it from itself.